This episode of Lex Out Loud is brought to you by the patrons of Starwalker Studios. Learn how you can support the show at lexstarwalker.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 39 of Lex Out Loud, writing science fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. This is a podcast for writers, readers, and all lovers of speculative fiction. I'm writing my third novel and taking you along for the ride. An essential part of preparing your novel for submission is participating in a writing group. This gives you a chance to get other writers' eyes on your novel so they can help you improve it. A very important part of being in a writing group is being able to give good critiques of other writers' work. Today I'm going to share some best practices for critiquing other writers so you all can make the most of the experience. Whew, I made it. Oh my gosh, it took me forever to get through that. I don't know what my problem is today. I had to keep... I'd screw up a sentence and I'd get that sentence right, then I'd screw up the next sentence. Oh my gosh. But I made it. I got through the intro finally. And yes, I'm finally going to talk about giving critiques today. I've been teasing this for quite a while now, just kept putting it off. I've had this episode written for weeks, probably more than a month. But I just had other topics keep coming to me that I wanted to do first. So we're finally getting to it today. And actually today, I finally got my schedule nailed down for the rest of this year, the rest of 2021, the rest of season 2 for Lex Out Loud. So I have all the episodes for the rest of the year planned, and I have most of them written. In fact, all of them are at least partially written except for the last 2. But I do know what those are going to be about. And so it feels good to have all that planned. So it's going to be another few weeks before I do the third and final episode in this series on writing groups, in which I will talk about receiving critiques, because I have some other things I want to talk about first. But today we're going to talk about giving good critiques. But before I get to that, I like to talk about what I'm up to. So as far as what I'm reading right now, I've been reading the book Billy Summers by Stephen King. And as of the time of recording this, it's his most recent novel that just came out. I think it's been a month or two now that it's been out. I'm really enjoying it. I was pretty pulled in from the beginning. Stephen King is such a good writer that he can kind of hook me with anything. And I found that true with any good writing, even if it's a character or a story that maybe normally I wouldn't be super into. If it's really well written, I tend to enjoy it. This book I'm having a lot of fun with. I'm a little over halfway at this point, and really, really enjoying it. And I feel like I've been so lucky lately because counting this book, Billy Summers, the last 3 books I've read have been really good and have been really hard to put down. And those are Project Hail Mary and Artemis, both by Andy Weir, and now Billy Summers by Stephen King. I've been reading these books so quickly just because once I get into them, I don't want to put it down. I just want to keep reading and find out what happens next. And it keeps me up late at night, long past where I should have gone to bed, because I just lose time reading these books, even though I'm reading this book on a Kindle, so I always have the time there. One thing I love about reading on Kindle is it gives you an estimate of how many more minutes it will take you to finish the chapter you're on. And, a lot of times it's well past my bedtime and I'm at a new chapter and it's telling me it's going to take, 28 minutes to read it. And I'm like, oh, what the hell? I can do one more chapter. But yeah, I'm really enjoying the book. I highly recommend it. I'll have a link to it in the show notes if you want to go pick it up on Amazon. And if you use that link, you help me out a little bit because it's an affiliate link. So thanks for that if you use it. I do finally have something to talk about as far as something that I'm watching. I finally got around to watching Squid Game, which you've probably heard about. I think right now it's the second most popular show in the United States on Netflix, or maybe in general, overall. And a few weeks ago, it was number one. So chances are really good you know about this show already, and you've probably already seen it. It's been out for a while. I was a little late to the party, but I think we're 4 or 5 episodes in now. So that's, I think, about halfway through the first season, and I'm really enjoying it. And yeah, it's a really great show. It's really well written and really well acted. I don't really want to say too much about it. I don't want to spoil anything, but I highly recommend it. It is a Korean show. And one thing that's really cool, I think this might be the first foreign show or movie I've watched on Netflix. And you have quite a few options as far as how you want to watch it, assuming you're an English speaker like I am. You can watch it in the original Korean with English subtitles. You can watch it with English overdubs with or without Korean subtitles. And I think there might be some other options too. Now, personally, I would really recommend you watch it in the original Korean with the English subtitles. We started watching the first episode with the overdub. I think that was just the default that Netflix was set to. And I really didn't care for it. I mean, I would much rather not have to read subtitles because it does take some getting used to. But I just felt that the overdubs, the voice acting for that wasn't great. Definitely wasn't as good as the actual actors. And I just found it highly distracting because, of course, the words aren't matching the movements of the people's lips and whatnot. And I just found that way more distracting and annoying than having to read subtitles. And the nice thing about, just reading the subtitles and hearing the original Korean, even if you can't understand it, which I can't, is that you hear the original actors' voices, and even though you can't understand what they're saying, you can hear their tone of voice and all that stuff. So that's what I recommend, that you try it that way. And yeah, I've been really enjoying that show. There's also a Korean movie that's on Netflix that I've been wanting to watch. I think maybe it's called Parasite. I think that might be it. I'm not sure 100% if that's the title, but I think it's a few years old now, but it was a very highly acclaimed movie. I don't really watch foreign films as a rule, and I remember hearing about it back when it first came out because I guess it's really good. But I've had that on my watch list to watch because I heard it was a really good movie, and I think it's suspenseful, I think is what I heard about it, that I wanted to watch it because wanting to learn more about writing suspense. And also, one of the main characters of the book I'm writing now is Korean. So I'm wanting to learn as much about Korean culture as I can, and watching Korean movies and TV shows is a pretty easy way to do that. I've also been, reading up on stuff, of course. But, at least that way you get to hear the language and see some of Korea, which is really cool. So I haven't watched that yet, but I plan to. I don't watch many movies lately anymore. It's kind of funny. I remember it wasn't that long ago where movies were kind of where it was at and TV kind of sucked. I'm thinking like the 80s and even the 90s, I think. But it's reversed now. I can't remember the last time I saw a movie that I really liked and thought was worth the money and the experience of going to a movie theater, which I don't tend to enjoy because of the people that are there and inconsiderate people. And now that, with the pandemic, really don't want to go to a movie theater. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the last movie I remember seeing that really stuck with me, that I just thought was a fantastic movie, was Inception. How long ago was that? That was forever ago. That might have been a decade or more ago now. Yeah, movies just kind of suck lately. This might be an unpopular opinion, but for the most part, I didn't enjoy any of the newer Star Wars movies. I'm not even talking about the prequels, the more recent ones, the recent trilogy and the Han Solo movie and Rogue One. Yeah, I didn't think any of them were that great. And the trilogy was especially bad. I mean, I actually kind of enjoyed the Han Solo movie. I wouldn't watch it again. It wasn't that great, but it was okay. Rogue One, I think I was kind of bored with that. I don't even really remember that movie. But yeah, the three movies, the trilogies, I thought they were terrible. So I've kind of just struck them from my mind, and I just remember the original Star Wars when it was at least halfway decent, and just ignore the other stuff. And yeah, I'm not a fan of all these Marvel movies. If you've seen one of those movies, you've seen them all. And yeah, it's just like so many of the movies now are just the same things recycled over and over, and the storytelling's pretty bad. It's just all about sensationalism and action sequences, and yeah, there's no real story, or not much of one, or not a very good one. So yeah, and just movies are so long. Every time my wife and I talk about maybe watching a movie, and I'm not even talking about going to the theater. I'm just like streaming one on Netflix or something. I'm just always like, it's such a commitment. I have to commit to an hour and a half or 2 hours of something that probably won't even be that great. And when it's over, I'll wish I'd done something else. Where, at least a TV show, it's a maximum of an hour that you're committing. A lot of times it's less, and they're just better. So yeah, I have another movie I've been wanting to watch, The Green Knight, I think, because I heard some good things about that. Of course, I've heard good things about a lot of movies that I saw and didn't think much of. And honestly, I'll probably never watch it because I've had it to stream since it was available to stream. I think it's been a month or two now, and I still haven't watched it just because I don't want to watch a long movie that probably won't be that great. So yeah, I probably won't ever watch it. But this Korean movie, I definitely want to watch because it's not a Hollywood movie. So I have hopes that it'll actually be a good movie. Yeah, so that's what I'm watching. And enough about that. Let's talk about giving good critiques. That was a terrible segue. That wasn't even a segue, but what are you going to do? So specifically, what I'm talking about today is giving a critique as part of a writing group, which I did a previous episode on writing groups that you can check out if you're not sure what being in a writing group entails. I talk all about that in that episode. But this could also apply to any time you're critiquing someone's writing, if you're like an alpha reader or a beta reader or something like that, or if just a writer just asks you what they thought of their book. If you want to go beyond I liked it or it was okay or, something like that from a writer's perspective isn't remotely useful. If you actually want to give them a useful critique, that's what we're talking about today is kind of how to approach that and some best practices, like I said at the beginning of the show. So the first thing when it comes to critiquing another writer is you want to come at it from the right mindset. And that mindset is that you are here to help this person. That's why you're doing this. You are doing this to help them. You are trying to encourage them, but you also are there to help them find any flaws in what they've done that maybe they've missed. When you spend the hours and hours and hours that it takes to write a novel, you are so immersed in what you're doing that there are going to be mistakes or things that are missing or plot holes or whatever that you're just never going to see because you're too close to it and you just don't notice it. Also, a part of it is, you wrote this, and unlike someone reading your book, not only do you know what's on the words on the page, but you also know all this stuff in your head that isn't on the page. And so sometimes you can think that there's, say, a piece of information that is on the page somewhere in the book, and it actually isn't. It's just in your head, and you may never catch that. But someone else reading your book that doesn't know all that stuff that's in your head, they can only go by what's actually in the book. They will most likely catch things like that. So that's why, having someone critique your work can be really helpful, or at least that's one reason. So, you're there to encourage them. You're definitely there to let them know what you think is working, what they're doing well, what you like about what they're doing, being as specific as you can. But you're also there to let them know any flaws that you see or anything you think isn't working or anything you think could be done better. But you want to do this as kindly and gently as possible. You're not here to demoralize them or demean them or get some kind of sick ego boost from making them feel bad about themselves and what they've worked so hard to achieve. I mean, if it's too sappy to say approach critiquing from a place of love, which it probably is, at least approach it from a place of kindness and a genuine desire to help. And, always ask yourself before you open your mouth and, critique this person's work, ask yourself, am I saying this to help them or am I saying it for some other reason? Also, another thing to keep in mind is this is most likely a work in progress, not the final draft. So you should remember that. And usually a good idea as part of a writing group or a critiquing process is the writer of the work that you're going to read and critique should kind of give you some idea where they are at in the process and what kind of critique they're looking for. So ideally, they're not showing you their first draft. I think I talked about this in the first writing group episode, but if you're in a writing group and you're going to have people critique your work, you should do your own editing first. You should at least do a second draft before you give it to other people to critique, if not do a few revisions instead of just one. But you should at least do one revision before you give it to someone else. It's not their job to catch all the stuff you could actually catch yourself, things like spelling errors, punctuation errors, using the wrong word, things like that. There's a lot that you can catch in your own work, and you should definitely do that before you ask someone else to look at it. Because the thing is everything that's wrong or not great is in a way a distraction, right? So if you've got spelling errors all over the place in this thing you ask someone to read, they're going to be so distracted by all the spelling errors that they're not going to notice the other problems that you can't spot yourself, because you should be able to spot the spelling errors yourself. I mean, this day and age, there's not really much of an excuse for spelling errors, if only because, if Word will spot 90+% of them for you. So all you got to do is go through your Word document and look for the red underlines under words. And then you can right click on that word and Word will give you suggestions of what they think the word is that you're trying to write and how you would spell that. So, now there are some exceptions to that. There are, I always get homophones and homonyms confused. But for instance, there are, 3 different twos, right, that have different meanings and different spellings in English. There's TO, TOO, and TWO. So, something like Word may not always catch mistakes like that if you're using the wrong two, or if you're using IT''S instead of ITS. Now, it gets better all the time, and a lot of times it will catch things like that, but not always. So, Word isn't going to help you catch 100% of your spelling errors, but it will help you catch a lot of them. And, it's not that hard to run a spell check and fix those. But you should also be actually reading through the thing yourself and looking for things that Word missed and fixing those before you give it to someone else to read. Oh, and by the way, speaking of spell checks, when you run a spell check, you never want to just automate it and just tell it to fix everything. You want to actually go through each thing it finds and make sure you want to do the fix it's suggesting, because again, it's not perfect and it may try to fix things that are actually correct, or it may find something that's wrong, but the fix it suggests isn't the right fix. So yeah, you never want to just do a spell check and just accept everything and not look through what it's suggesting first, like item by item. So it takes some time, but not nearly as long as it does doing it by hand. All right. So anyway, my point is you want to get rid of the stuff you can get rid of first as far as mistakes, because those things are just adding more noise to your novel and they will distract the reader. So instead of getting a critique about maybe some plot problems you might have or some characterization problems you might have. Instead, you just get your manuscript back with red ink everywhere, fixing spelling errors, because the person was so distracted by all of that, they never even got to the higher level stuff, which is what you really need them for, the stuff you can't necessarily find on your own. So, keep in mind, this is a work in progress, and keep in mind what kind of critiquing the writer is asking for. So, they might say, I'm not worried about spelling errors right now. I'm worried about, are the characters believable to you? Do the things that the characters do and say make sense to you? Do you buy it? Does it seem like something someone would actually do and say? Do you find the character sympathetic, the main character? Do you like the character? Things like that. So always be mindful of what the writer is specifically asking you for from the critique. And if they don't give you any guidelines, ask them, what are you looking for here? What kind of critique are you worried about? Or maybe they're wanting to know about any plot holes, or whether or not the antagonist is believable, or maybe they have a female character and you're talking about a male writer and they want to know, is this female character believable? From those of you who are women, do you buy this female character? Or am I doing things as a male writer without knowing it that aren't making sense to you, that you're thinking this is not how a woman would think or behave? Things like that. So when it comes to actually giving the critique, let's say you're in your writing group and it's your turn to give your critique of this person's work, you always, always, always want to start out your critique with something positive. Start out with the things that you liked about the chapter, the things that you thought were working, the things that you thought the writer did well. And, if you really didn't like it or there were a lot of problems, find something positive to say. Point out, what's working for you in the story and anything you particularly liked. Maybe there were certain characters you liked or certain scenes you thought were really cool, or lines of dialogue you really enjoyed, things like that. And be mindful of this when you're actually doing the critique on your own, when you're reading it through and marking up the copy for when you talk to them later. Remember, you don't want to just look for mistakes and things you don't like. You also want to find some things that you do like so you can start out with something positive. So remember that when you're actually reading the thing, to keep an eye out for things that you think are done especially well. Be generous with your compliments, but don't be insincere. You don't want to, like they say, you don't want to blow sunshine up their ass. You want to give them legitimate compliments, because there's kind of two aspects to this and why we do it this way. First off, you're about to tear this person's baby apart. And that's always difficult. Anytime someone critiques your work, it's difficult to hear, especially when there's things that they think aren't working. So it can really help with that if you butter their bread a little bit first, right? It's always easier to take some criticism when the person has first said some nice things about what you did. If someone starts critiquing your work and they just lay into it from the get-go and start listing all these things that they didn't like or that aren't working, that's a lot harder to take than if they start out with a few things that they really liked and kind of get you feeling good about it first, and then go into things that didn't work so well. And at the very end of this, I'm going to have an example of a good critique that will kind of bring all this together. So that's part of it, buttering their bread a little bit first, making the negative things that you're about to say easier to take. But the other aspect is, it is helpful to know what you're doing right, especially when there's a lot of things that have problems. It's really easy as a writer to get discouraged and feel like everything you do is crap, when there's a lot of problems that people are pointing out in your work. And keep in mind, in a normal writing group, you might have 4 or 5 different people critiquing this work today, this chapter of your book. And they might all be pointing out a lot of things that they think are wrong, and they're all pointing out different things. So altogether, it adds up to a lot of stuff that you didn't get quite right. And it can, especially for a newer writer, it can be really easy to feel like you're not doing anything right. So it is helpful to point out the things that they are doing right, especially if there's things that they're doing especially well, because you don't want them in the scramble to try to fix this thing and try to make it better. You don't want them to change something that they're doing that actually is working. So, maybe, you've got a list of criticisms a mile long about this chapter, but maybe the dialogue's really good. Or maybe you really like the main character and you really care about this character and what they're trying to do. Or maybe you think they give some really evocative, really great descriptions that are really vivid and really put you in the place, but also aren't too long or wordy. Things like that. So those are things that you want to point out first. Are those things that they're doing well, and especially if there's anything they're doing really, really well that you're impressed by, start with that. However, and this is really important, you've got to be sincere. Okay, when you're pointing out the things that you think they did well, they have to be things that you legitimately thought they did well. An insincere compliment is far worse than no compliment at all, because they're going to see through it. And it's going to make them even feel worse than if you hadn't said anything nice at all. I mean, you should be able to find something that you sincerely liked in the chapter that they gave you. That, even if it's something small, find something that they're doing right, or they're at least on the path, or they're going in the right direction. Find something that you can sincerely say, hey, this is pretty good what you did here. Do more of that. So now once you've done that, then you can go into the things that didn't work so well for you and why. Be as specific as possible. I really liked it, or I really didn't like it isn't remotely helpful. If you can give specific things that you liked and why you liked them or didn't like them, then that's a lot more useful. Try to keep your emotions out of it. Maybe a certain character, as you're reading it, just really pisses you off for some reason. Or maybe you just really hated something that happened in the story. Maybe there was something that happened that you really didn't like, or a scene you really didn't like, or something like that. You don't need to dump your emotions on the writer. You don't need to express to this writer how much you hate their character, or, how much you hate what happened to this kid in their story. That isn't helpful. Listen to yourself as you're doing the critique. If you're raising your voice, if you're getting upset, like sounding upset and angry while you're giving the critique, then you need to take a breath or two and calm down, because that's not what we're here to do, and that's not helpful. It's the opposite of helpful. Don't dump your emotions on them. Also, I have to say, as someone who's received critiques and listened to critiques and given critiques, these emotional reactions that people have, where they get very emotional when they're critiquing, often say much more about the person doing their critique than they do about the writer or the work that the writer submitted. So, in addition to not helping this person and making them feel really bad about what they did, maybe, you also may be making an ass of yourself and making a fool of yourself and revealing a lot about yourself that you really don't want to be revealing. So think about that. Be dispassionate and try to be objective. Remember, this is another human being on the receiving end of this. Hopefully it's someone you respect and maybe even like at some level. So remember that, and say things in a way that you would want them said to you. Put yourself in their shoes. And if you'd written this thing, how would you want to be spoken to? And I'm not saying that, if there's a character you really didn't like, or there's a scene that really bothered you, that you can't tell them, but it's all about how you say it. It's all about the words that you use and your tone of voice and your body language and all that stuff. If you're yelling at them and your face is all red and you're in their face, that's not good. Focus on identifying what's not working for you. Try to get at why it's not working for you, or what specifically isn't working, and then try to convey this to the writer. But you don't necessarily want to give your opinions on how they could or should fix it. And in fact, that's usually the general rule is you just want to point out the issues, and you don't really want to say, this is how you should fix it, because it's not your story. Let them figure out how they want to fix it. Now, if they ask you, that's one thing. If you maybe you really don't like the main point of view character and you find them completely unsympathetic and you're not rooting for them, and you tell the writer that, maybe the writer asked you, well, I mean, probably they would ask you specifically what you don't like, which would be helpful if you could share, if you could understand that and share that with them. Well, these are the things that make me not like this character. But they may ask you, well, what could I do to make them more likable, or to make them more sympathetic? And if they ask, then that's one thing. But remember, at all times, your job is to point out issues or possible issues, because again, or I guess I haven't said this yet, but just because you don't like something, or you think something isn't as good as it could be, or you have a problem with something, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. Sometimes a given reader just has an issue with something and no one else has a problem with it, or very few other people would have a problem with it. So it's not, just because you have a problem with something doesn't mean you're in the right and what the writer did is wrong or bad. So keep that in mind. But your job is to point out the issues that you have or the issues that you see. Your job is not to rewrite the story for the writer. Just remember that. Don't try to rewrite it for them. A good critique requires a lot of thought and self-analysis, not just, oh, I don't like this, and not just, I don't like this because of X, Y, and Z, but also, why don't I like this? Is there something objectively here that's a problem, or is this more something personal with me that I don't like this? For instance, let me give you an example, because we all have our biases, right? So I don't like religion. I don't like religious characters. So as soon as there's a character in a book, especially if it's a point of view character that's very religious and kind of thinks with magical thinking and things like that, like, I am very inclined not to like that character and not to like what's going on. So that's something I know about myself. So anytime I start reacting negatively to a religious character, especially if I'm going to critique this, I really need to ask myself, is the problem really with this character, or what's happening, or how this is written? Or is the problem just that I don't like religious characters, which is kind of my thing, right? Because if that's what's going on, if it's really just I don't like religious characters, then that's not helpful to the writer, unless they're just going to make this character not religious just to make me happy. But I'm not every reader. I'm probably not even the majority of readers. So just because I don't like religious characters doesn't mean that thousands or millions of other readers might not love religious characters, right? So always try to remember your own biases and hangups and things like that, and ask yourself, where is this coming from? Is this really a problem with what's written on the page here, or is it more the way I'm reacting to it, which is my own personal thing? So saying that you don't like a certain character isn't particularly helpful. Saying a character doesn't seem realistic to you isn't terribly helpful. However, if you can point out specifically what the character said or what the character did that caused some kind of disconnect for you, then that is more helpful. Another thing you can do in your critique, especially if you're going to give back the manuscript, because at least the writing groups I've been in, the way we did it is we would share chapters of our novels through, something like Dropbox or whatever. So everyone would download, let's say I submit a chapter, everyone would download my chapter, and then they would print it out and they would read it. And while they're reading it, they would mark it up with, a lot of times people would, if they saw a spelling error or a punctuation error, they'd mark that. Or, you could circle a passage that you particularly liked and in the margin write why you liked it. or you could circle something that you didn't like and write why you didn't. And then when the writing group got together, there's never time to go through all of that. So the person critiquing would have their copy of your chapter that they've marked up. And the ones that were really good at it would somewhere make a list of what they wanted to say during the actual critique. And they'll hit the highlights with you in the critique of some of the things they really liked and some of the big problems they saw. But then they would give you the chapter they printed and marked up so that later you could go and see all this other stuff that they didn't have time to tell you about during the critique. Because you usually only get like 5 or 10 minutes per person to critique, or you're going to be there all day. So at least the groups I've been in, that's usually how it was done. So if you're doing that, one thing you can do is what they call the red line of death, or if you're not giving people marked up copies of their work back, you could just tell them where this is. So this mostly works with the beginning of a novel, the first chapter or first few chapters. And the red line of death is merely, if you were just a reader reading this for fun, assuming for some reason the book isn't working for you and you would put the book down, at what point would you quit reading? And you draw a line there. If it's a thing where there comes a point where you're like, I wouldn't read this book anymore, you could draw the line there and tell the person, this is the point where as a reader, I would just quit reading your book and here's why. Or if it's a book that you would keep reading, another thing you could do is put that line where you think you would put it down the first time. You know what I mean? Where things slow down and you're like, oh, it's the end of a chapter. This is where I'd put the book down and go do something else and come back to it later. Usually it's the first type that writers are worried about. Like, if this isn't working for you, where is the point where you're so turned off that you would just give up on this book? But again, that's only helpful if that reason is an issue with the actual story or the way it's written, and it's not just a thing of it's a science fiction story and you don't like science fiction, right? So that's only helpful if the reason isn't a personal reason that's only relevant to you, the reader, and isn't about the work itself. Also, you want to prioritize your critiques because you're only going to have a limited amount of time to critique. So you want to start with the positive. You want to give the biggest positives first and then going down. And then the same thing with the negative things. You want to start with what you saw as the biggest problem in the piece, or what you think your most important critique is. You want to start with that so that, you get the most important stuff done first. Kind of like the idea of triage. If you're familiar with that in healthcare, I used to be an EMT. So, if you're an EMS and you go to the scene of a car accident, you treat the people who are most seriously injured first. If you've got one person who has a gushing arterial wound and they're going to bleed out in a matter of minutes or seconds, and then you've got another person who, just has a broken leg, but otherwise they're okay, then you treat the gushing wound first, kind of thing. So it's the same kind of idea. You want to start with the biggest issues or the most important critiques, and then go down in priority from there, because chances are you won't have time to talk about everything. You also tend to want to focus on higher level critiques versus lower level critiques, and I already talked about this a little bit. So in other words, focus on things like characterization, plot, theme, mood, things like that. Don't get into low level stuff like spelling, punctuation errors, and stuff like that, unless there's really nothing else to talk about, or you've already covered the high level stuff and you still have time. And I have been in writing groups where I've read a chapter where it was just really good, and I really didn't have anything as far as constructive criticism to say without being like, oh, you should put a comma here, or, oh, you forgot to capitalize this, or, oh, you misspelled this. Sometimes that's really the only problems you can find, and then that's fine. But if there are more of those higher level things, then that's really what you want to talk about. Because again, things like, capitalization, spelling, punctuation errors are easy enough for the writer to find on their own. At the end of the day, a vague something about this just doesn't seem quite right to me is better than nothing. So there will be times where there's where something's not right, but you can't put your finger on what it is or why it's not working. So don't be afraid if that's the case. Don't be afraid to mention that, just because you can't give them a specific reason or a specific indication of what exactly is going wrong, because it can still be helpful. If they know there's a problem with a certain character or a certain scene, but you're not sure what it is, you can't really tell them, what exactly the problem is. At least they know there's something there, especially if multiple people in the group are seeing the same issue, and it at least tells them that there's a problem and maybe they can figure it out. Or, maybe one of the other people in the group notice that too, and maybe they have a more specific idea of what's actually going on. I think you also want to limit the amount of negative critiques. There's only so much a writer can take before they just get numb or so upset that it's not being helpful anymore. So, if you hated everything about the story, there's no need to point out every single little flaw that you saw just to prove what an awesome critiquer you are. That's not going to be helpful. Instead, focus on the major issues or the biggest issues you saw and that are also representative instances of maybe overarching issues. So maybe this book has a number of female characters, and maybe all of the female characters are completely unbelievable. You don't need to point out everything that every female character said and did that you found unbelievable. Instead, find a few representative examples where if the writer figures out what they're doing wrong there, then they can apply that to the rest of the book. So just give them a few good examples of the issue. You don't have to point out every single case. Another great example for this is use of the passive voice. So if this chapter is just filled with passive voice, again, you don't need to point out every time they're using passive voice. Now, if you're going to give them the manuscript back and you're editing it and you want to circle with your red pen every time they use passive voice when you think they shouldn't, go for it. But when you're giving the verbal critique, you don't need to do that. Instead, like I said, find a few examples of times and places that they're using the passive voice when it would be better to use the active voice, and just point those out during your verbal critique. Again, I know I kind of keep harping on this, but this is probably the most important point I can get across to you today, is the best way to give a critique is to be dispassionate and kind. Don't get angry at how bad the story is or how much you don't like a character. That's not helpful. Be objective and unemotional in your speech. Word things in a kind way. Think about how you're phrasing things, your body language, stuff like that. Keep in mind, most writers, all writers are self-conscious about their work, and having someone critique your work is very hard, even if they like it. Even if there's only a few things they don't like. It's really hard when they really don't like it, especially with an earlier draft. So, respect that. Besides, if you're in a writing group, you're going to be the one in the spotlight, in the hot seat pretty soon. So, you get what you give a lot of times. So keep that in mind. Treat the other writers how you would want them to treat you. Focus on I statements and avoid you statements. So instead of focusing on what the writer did or didn't do, focus the reaction on how we're reacting to what we read. Remember, we're critiquing the work, we're critiquing the story, the chapter, we're not critiquing the writer. So try to avoid saying things like, you did this or you didn't do that. Instead say things like, when the character did this, I didn't buy it, or this description or this scene is written very passively, or things like that. Just try to avoid sounding accusatory or constantly talking about the writer and using the word you. If you just avoid using the word you, that helps a lot. So for example, instead of saying you weren't clear in this paragraph, say, I was confused by this paragraph. Did you mean X or did you mean Y? Or instead of saying your main character isn't at all believable, say something like, When the main character did X, I didn't really buy it. I don't think someone in that situation with that background that that character has would do that. I think they would have done Y instead. Notice how here, not only am I making it about the character, the work, instead of about the writer, I'm also being more specific about what isn't working and why. Appreciate that the writer may be going for a specific tone or a specific voice that just isn't your preference. This could cover things like word choice. So if the wrong word is used, that's one thing. If they use a word that doesn't mean what they think it means, that's one thing. But if you just don't like the word or you think there's a better word, that may be a thing of the voice that the writer is going for or just their style. So, leave them alone with stuff like that. A subset of this point is the use of profanity. If you personally have a problem with profanity, like you don't like swear words, keep it to yourself. Don't critique the work based on that. Again, that is your personal reaction to the work. It doesn't have anything to do with the work itself. Some people use profanity. It's just reality. So any writer who's doing their job and being honest, assuming they're not writing a book for young children, will probably have at least some profanity in it. Depending on the main character and their background, there may be a lot of profanity. The question is, does it fit the story and does it fit the character? Not does it fit your own worldview or ideas or preferences of how you think people should talk. So an example of this is I just read 2 books by Andy Weir, Project Hail Mary and Artemis. And in Project Hail Mary, there's either very little or no profanity in it. And the main character does not use any profanity. And even, sounds pretty silly sometimes because they'll use words like fudge and gosh and things like that instead of profanity. But there's a reason based on who that character is that they talk that way. And it makes sense and it works for the story. Artemis, on the other hand, there's a lot more profanity in that book, and the main character uses a good amount of profanity, but again, it fits that character and how that character would talk. So even a given writer, may have different amounts of profanity in different books or in different parts of different books based on the characters involved and how they talk. It's just representing the world in a truthful way, which is what writing is all about. Stephen King actually talks about this a bit in his book on writing. He says it's the job of the writer to be honest in representing the world and the people in it. For example, just because the writer writes a character who abuses dogs doesn't mean the writer abuses dogs or thinks abusing dogs is okay. The writer is honestly representing a world in which there exists people who abuse dogs, which I think we can all acknowledge that that is the world we live in. Seriously, you may think this is crazy or wonder why I'm even talking about this, but seriously, there seem to be a not small number of people who don't get this, who don't understand this, who will get upset because of something a character does in a book and think that the writer is condoning that, whatever it is, just because it happens in their book. Hopefully no one like that would be in your writing group, but you never know. All right, so I promised that at the end of this, I would give an example of a good critique. And because a lot of times with stuff like this, a single good example will be far more illuminating than me going on and on about the do's and don'ts of good critiquing. I'm really lucky that I found this example in a book I read recently, which I talked about this book, I think, last week. So I recently read the book, Becoming a Writer, Staying a Writer by J. Michael Straczynski. And I don't think I mentioned in the last episode when I mentioned this book, I guess I just assumed everyone would know who he is. But if you don't know who he is or you can't quite put your finger on it, he was the writer and producer for Babylon 5, also the Netflix series Sense8. He's written tons of comic books and graphic novels and episodes of TV shows, including one of the Twilight Zone reboots. He's written tons of stuff. But he also wrote this book about the craft and life and business of writing that I really enjoyed. And there's a link to that book in the show notes. It's called Becoming a Writer, Staying a Writer, and there's a subtitle I can't remember right now. But he has this example from his book of what a good critique might sound like. And I'm going to pause. It's a rather lengthy paragraph. At least in this book, he likes writing really long paragraphs. That's just his style, his choice. So I'm going to break this up occasionally and kind of give my own commentary on what's happening here and why this is an example of how to approach giving a good critique. So here's what a constructive criticism might sound like. I can see you put a lot of work into this, and there are some nice beats to it. I like the supporting characters, and the writing style was tight. Okay, so we're starting with something positive. This person critiquing is starting with something that he liked about what he read before he starts getting into things that didn't work so well for him. What didn't work, at least for me, was the motivation of the main character. You say, or more accurately, he says, that he's killing all these people to avenge his brother's murder. But we never actually see the murder, or how he and his brother got along before that happened. So if you want us to understand the extreme steps he's taking to be the avenging angel, I feel like it's important to see them together before the murder. It's not enough for the character to just say it as a plot point or a rationalization for the audience. We should feel the reasons for what he does, and we can only do that if you connect the dots. It's clear that you know what happened, that you have all these really great scenes in your head, so my suggestion would be to move some of those scenes from the implied to the scene, either at the beginning of the story, or if you feel strongly about the need to hit the ground running, then maybe in flashbacks or transitional pieces between some of the action sequences. So you notice here, he's pointing out what didn't work for him. He doesn't get emotional. He doesn't attack the writer. He keeps it about the work, about the story, what's happening in the story. He explains what isn't working for him, and then he gives some ideas for possible solutions. Now, remember I said usually you don't want to do that. You don't want to give solutions. The idea behind that guideline of not giving solutions is that you don't want to tell the person how to tell their story or how to write their book. You don't want to try to do it for them or try to convince them to do things the way that you would want to do it. However, keeping that in mind, if you can keep that in mind, there's nothing wrong with, giving some possible solutions, especially if you can give more than one and make it clear that you're not saying this is what you should do, merely here's some ideas of how you could approach this, take them or leave them, which is what this does. Also notice that he slipped in another compliment here by saying that it's clear the writer has ideas that they're not sharing on the page, instead of assuming that the writer doesn't know anything more than what's on the page. And you'll, or at least I've seen this a lot in critiques when people get nasty, is they act like that there's nothing else in the writer's head other than what's on the page, not realizing or forgetting that there's probably a lot of stuff that the writer knows that for whatever reason they didn't put down on the paper, or maybe they think they did and it's just not there and they think it is. So, don't assume the writer is a moron or that this is all they've got. There's probably a lot more. All right, so back to Michael's critique. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. And I'd be curious to know if anyone else in the group felt the same way, or if they felt that the implied relationship between the brothers was strong enough that seeing it would be redundant. So here, he's reminding the writer that this is only his opinion, and he's acknowledging that others in the group or other readers may not agree with him. And he then opens it up to the other members of the group to either chime in with agreement and possibly give additional possible solutions, or to let us know if they don't agree and why they don't agree. So again, it's humility, right? You're not assuming that your critique is the end all be all or that everything you're saying is right or valid. And it's a great idea to, at the end, ask the other people in the group if they want to chime in, either agreeing with what you're saying and maybe giving other possible solutions or other possible examples. Or maybe someone doesn't agree with what you're saying and they think that it's either good the way it is or the problem is something else entirely. Notice here that there is zero ego for the critiquer here. This isn't about Michael at all. This isn't about trying to make himself sound smart or trying to make the writer feel less than. It's just a legitimate and sincere attempt to improve the story as he sees it. So I think through the words he chooses, he conveys that he's just trying to help. And he's not being belittling or demeaning in any way, and he's being humble and supportive. So yeah, that's a great example of the right way to do a critique. And if you want to read that yourself, then I highly recommend you get Straczynski's book and read it. I really enjoyed it. I'd say that book and On Writing are definitely my two favorite books on writing I've read. I've read a lot of books on writing, and a lot of them are just saying the same obvious things over and over. These are the two books that I really felt I learned from and felt were going beyond the obvious stuff that so many writing books talk about that you probably already know. One thing that was nice about Straczynski's book compared to Stephen King's, and why I like both of them, is they were different in some ways. They both went over events of their lives that shaped them as writers, which I think is actually very helpful. Straczynski went into, well, I guess they both went into the business aspect of it, but Straczynski also has a lot of experience as a script writer and working in TV and I think movies as well. So, he brought elements of that world into it that Stephen King really didn't. And I found that really interesting, his discussions of dealing with agents and editors and specifically the people out there who are frauds or con artists who are trying to take advantage of you, and kind of how to avoid people like that and how to recognize when that's happening or that's the kind of person you're dealing with. I found that really helpful. It was a bit more geared toward the film and TV industries, but was still unfortunately relevant to publishing as well, because there are definitely agents and editors out there who are not the real deal and will try to take advantage of you if you let them. So I found that really useful and informative and educational. So yeah, I highly recommend both the books. They both have, different spins on things and cover different areas to larger, lesser degrees. They're not redundant to one another at all. But yeah, check them out if you're interested in learning more about writing. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for today. That's everything I could think of as far as what I've learned about giving critiques and what I've read and heard about, the best ways to approach it. I kind of compiled all that I could find together and tried to present that to you the best way I know how, and hopefully that's helpful to you. I'm sure it's not exhaustive. So if there's something I missed or other advice to be given, feel free to let me know, and I can always revisit this at a later date. You can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. You can call my voicemail 951-465-5391. And finally, you can join our community on Discord. And you can find a link to our Discord community as well as links to the things I talked about today in the show notes at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, keep writing.